Snow drifts across the narrow mountain road like torn feathers in the wind. A single carriage fights its way through the storm, its wheels crunching over frozen mud. Inside, Vanessa holds the reins with stiff, trembling fingers. Her breath clouds the air, each exhale a quiet tremor of regret. Beside her, Zayden, 7 years old, presses a small wooden horse against his chest, the last thing his father made before he died. His eyes are wide, full of trust she no longer deserves. The storm howls louder than her heartbeat, louder than the voice begging her to stop. The cabin comes into view, broken roof, leaning walls, a wound in the middle of the white valley. She slows the horse, whispers, "Count to 10, sweetheart." He nods, smiling. By the time he reaches 10, the road is empty. What kind of love makes someone leave the very thing they can't stop loving? The cabin door groaned as it shut behind him, echoing through the hollow room like a sigh from something tired of being forgotten. Zayden stood still for a long moment, his small hands clutching the loaf of bread so tightly that crumbs broke loose between his fingers. The air smelled of damp wood and ashes long cold. Every corner held a shadow. He could hear the wind pressing against the walls, testing the gaps. He set the bread down carefully on a crooked table and looked around. A spider's web glimmered in the weak light from the window. Dust floated like snow, soft and slow. His voice came out as a whisper. "Don't worry, house. I'll take care of you." He spoke as if the cabin could hear, as if it too needed comfort. Then he began to move, dragging an old stool near the fireplace, stacking bits of wood he'd gathered from outside. His fingers were numb, his breath fogging in the cold, but he worked with the focus of someone who knew there was no one else coming. The first spark refused to catch. He struck the match again, this time shielding it with his hand. A tiny flame appeared, trembling. He bent close, feeding it twigs until the orange glow filled the dark corners of the room. It wasn't much, but it was alive. He sat back and watched the fire grow, its light flickering across the wooden walls. He tore off a small piece of bread and chewed slowly, trying to make it last. The rest he wrapped in the handkerchief and tucked beneath the table as though it were gold. Hunger gnawed at him, but the thought of tomorrow was heavier. The cabin creaked, adjusting to the night. He listened to the sound of the wind slipping through the cracks, the faint drip of melted snow, the distant cry of something wild. The world outside was enormous and empty. Inside, it was just him, and the small rhythm of fire breathing beside him. He glanced at the toy horse lying on the table, its wooden surface smooth from his father's hands. He reached for it, holding it against his chest. "She'll come back," he whispered, half to the horse, half to the fire. "Mama said she would." The flames danced higher, throwing his shadow against the wall. For a second, it looked like someone was standing beside him. He smiled, pretending it was her, pretending he wasn't alone. As the night deepened, exhaustion pulled at his eyes. He curled up on the dirt floor near the warmth, covering himself with his small coat. Outside, the wind howled over the mountain, carrying with it the sound of hooves fading into forever. Before sleep took him, he whispered into the quiet, "Don't go too far, Mama. I'll wait." The fire popped softly, a single spark jumping upward. It burned bright, then disappeared, like a promise carried away by the wind. When morning came, frost traced the inside of the window like veins of glass. The world beyond was white and endless. Zayden rose slowly, rubbing his arms for warmth. He stepped outside barefoot, the snow biting his feet. The silence felt bigger in daylight, the kind that makes you realize how small you are. He walked to the edge of the clearing, calling softly, "Mama!" The wind answered with nothing but cold. He stood there for a long moment before turning back toward the cabin. Inside, the fire had died down to gray ash. He knelt and stirred it, blowing gently until a faint orange glow returned. "See," he murmured, "you're still here." He spent the rest of that morning exploring the cracked shelves, the broken chair, the water barrel out back. Everything around him seemed wounded, yet waiting. He found an old tin cup and used it to catch drops of melted snow from the roof. When he tasted the water, it was clean, sharp, and real. That afternoon, hunger came again. He unwrapped the bread and broke off another small piece, then tucked the rest back under the table. He ate slowly, chewing each bite as if it might teach him patience. As the sun began to fall, he gathered more branches from outside, careful not to go too far. The forest loomed tall and dark, its trees whispering secrets he couldn't understand. He imagined they were talking about him, the little boy who didn't belong here, the one who was still waiting for someone who wasn't coming. Back in the cabin, he lit the fire again and pressed his hands close to it. His fingers were scratched and pink from the cold. He stared at the flames until they blurred. Night came faster than he expected. The light faded, and the cabin filled once more with shadows. He lay down near the fire, his back against the wall. The toy horse rested beside him, its wooden head facing the door. The silence outside deepened until even the wind stopped to listen. Somewhere far away, an owl called out. Zayden closed his eyes, whispering, "Tomorrow will be better. Mama will come back." The camera would pull back now, out through the cracked roof, over the snow-covered trees, until the tiny glow of his fire was the only color in the valley. A small light in a vast wilderness. He slept without knowing that this night, the first one he survived alone, would become the beginning of everything that would follow. The mountain had taken away what he loved, but it had also given him something in return, the quiet courage to keep the fire alive. The days began to fold into one another, quiet and endless. Morning always arrived with the same gray light spilling through the cracks in the cabin roof. Zayden woke to the sound of wind against the boards and the soft hum of the forest waking up. Each day carried a rhythm now, not taught by anyone, but learned by living. He stepped outside barefoot, the snow having melted into damp soil, soft and cold beneath his toes. The valley breathed around him, filled with the chatter of birds, the rush of a nearby stream, and the rustle of unseen animals. He would fill his tin cup with rainwater, wash his face, and whisper a greeting to the morning as if it were an old friend. The world had stopped being just a place. It had become a teacher. Zayden learned the shape of survival, how to pull bark from fallen trees for kindling, how to stack rocks into small traps that might catch a rabbit or two, how to watch the sky to guess when storms were coming. His hands grew rough and stained with soil, but his heart grew steadier. By midday, he would wander through the woods, careful not to stray too far. The forest had its own music, branches snapping, streams whispering, leaves breathing. Sometimes, when he stood still, he thought he could hear it talking. He began to listen. At night, the cabin no longer felt like a cage but a shell. It held the sounds of his small world, the crackle of fire, the soft drip of melting snow from the roof, the creak of the wooden door when the wind pushed against it. He started to believe the cabin listened back. One afternoon, while gathering wood near the stream, Zayden heard a sharp, desperate cry. It wasn't human, too raw, too wild. He froze, scanning the trees. The sound came again, weaker this time, from somewhere behind a cluster of rocks. He pushed through the bushes, heart pounding, and found it, a small gray wolf cub, one leg caught in a metal snare. Its fur was dirty, tangled with blood. The cub growled weakly, baring tiny teeth, too afraid to fight. Zayden dropped to his knees, whispering softly, "Hey, hey, it's okay. I won't hurt you." His voice trembled, but his hands stayed gentle. The animal flinched when he reached forward, but he didn't stop. He pressed down on the trap springs, freeing the small leg from the iron jaws. The cub whimpered once, then fell still. He wrapped it in his coat, careful not to press the wound. It was lighter than he expected, bones and fur, shaking with pain. As he carried it back to the cabin, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Inside, he laid it beside the fire and cleaned the wound with warm water, using a torn piece of cloth to stop the bleeding. The cub twitched but didn't bite. When it looked up at him, its eyes were a soft gray, the color of the morning sky. "I'll call you Ash," Zayden whispered. "You're the color of the fire when it's almost gone." For a while, the cub didn't move. Zayden sat beside it, feeding the fire with bits of bark. He spoke softly, telling it stories about his father, about the toy horse, about the mountain that never spoke back. He didn't expect it to understand, but the act of talking made the silence less heavy. By the third day, Ash lifted its head and licked his hand. The touch startled him, not because it hurt, but because it felt like trust. From then on, they became a pair. Zayden shared his bread, tearing it into small pieces and soaking it in water so Ash could eat. He fetched water from the creek, cleaned the wound daily, and wrapped it in soft cloth. When he slept, he could feel the cub's slow breathing beside him, steady as his own. Nights turned warmer. Sometimes Ash would whimper in its sleep, and Zayden would rest his hand gently on its back. "It's all right," he'd whisper. "We're still here." In the mornings, Ash followed him outside, limping at first, then walking stronger each day. Together they explored the edges of the forest, Ash sniffing the air, Zayden marking trees with small carvings so he wouldn't lose his way. The world that had once felt endless and cruel began to feel alive, even welcoming. He learned to read the forest differently now. The sound of snapping branches no longer frightened him. It told him something was moving nearby. The calls of birds became warnings or greetings. When the wind shifted, he could smell rain before it came. The wilderness stopped being a punishment. It started feeling like a home that had been waiting for him to learn its language. Sometimes, when the sun dipped low and the valley turned gold, Zayden would sit by the creek with Ash at his side. He'd skip stones across the water, counting how many times they bounced before sinking. The wolf would watch, its head tilted, as if trying to understand the game. In those quiet hours, he forgot the sound of hooves fading away. He forgot the face of the woman who left him in the snow. All that remained was the rhythm of the stream, the whisper of the trees, and the steady breath of the creature beside him. One evening, after a long day of walking, Zayden sat outside the cabin, his back against the door. The sky was burning orange and red, the air still and heavy with the scent of pine. Ash lay curled at his feet, eyes half closed. He looked at the forest and said softly, "If you listen long enough, the forest talks back." It wasn't a question. It was a truth. Somewhere, far above, a hawk cried out, and the sound echoed across the valley. Zayden closed his eyes and smiled. The world was no longer silent. It spoke to him now, not in words, but in wind, fire, and heartbeat. He had come to the mountain as a boy waiting to be saved. He was now becoming something else, someone who no longer waited, someone who lived. The first signs of winter returned slowly, the sharp breath of morning air, the thin crust of frost on the window's edge, the way the forest grew quieter each day. Zayden could feel it coming before the first snowflake even fell. The birds stopped singing. The stream slowed. The world began to hold its breath. He gathered what he could: stacks of firewood, dried leaves, a few handfuls of berries that had survived the cold. But it was never enough. Each sunrise brought colder wind, and each night stretched longer than the one before. Ash sensed it too. The wolf's fur thickened, its movements slower, cautious. They worked together now, a wordless rhythm born of necessity. Zayden hunted what little he could trap: rabbits, sometimes nothing at all. Hunger became familiar, sitting with him like an uninvited guest. The snow started as dust and turned to a storm. By the second week, the valley was buried. The forest disappeared beneath white, and even the creek fell silent, sealed under ice. Inside the cabin, the cold crept in through every crack. Zayden pushed old blankets against the walls, stuffed moss into the holes, anything to keep the wind out. The fire burned low, his only heartbeat in a frozen world. Nights were the hardest. The wind screamed outside, battering the roof until the wood moaned. Sometimes it felt like the mountain itself was trying to crush them. One night, when the blizzard howled louder than ever, part of the roof gave way. Snow poured through the gap, scattering over the floor. The sudden cold was like knives against his skin. Ash barked, snapping awake, pressing close to him. Zayden dragged a stool beneath the opening, shoving a plank of wood across it, but the storm was stronger. The fire flickered, then shrank to a trembling glow. He crouched beside it, shaking from exhaustion, his hands cupped around the flame. "No," he whispered, voice cracking. "Stay alive, please." The smoke stung his eyes, but he didn't look away. He thought of his father's voice, strong, steady, saying, "Son, fire listens. Treat it like a friend." He pressed closer, feeding it scraps of bark, torn fabric, anything that would burn. But nothing caught. The match burned out in his hand. The next one, too. The cold pressed against his back like a weight. Ash whined softly, curling against his leg. Zayden pulled the wolf closer, their breaths mingling in the thin air. "If I keep the light alive," he whispered into the darkness, "the house will live too." He looked at the table where his wooden horse rested, the last piece of his father he still had. Its edges were worn smooth from years of holding it close. It was the one thing he swore never to let go. But now, the cabin was dying. And so was he. His hands trembled as he reached for it. He stared at the small figure in the firelight, the carved mane, the chipped ear, the faint smell of smoke from old memories. His throat tightened. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "But you'd want me to live." He pressed the toy into the embers. For a moment, it refused to catch. Then, with a small crack, the wood darkened, smoke curling upward. The fire took hold, growing from orange to gold. Light filled the room again, bright and warm, washing over the walls, chasing back the shadows. The heat stung his face, but he didn't pull away. He watched until the small figure was gone, turned to Ash. Ash, the wolf, lifted its head, ears twitching. Its eyes glowed in the flicker, calm and unafraid. Zayden felt something break inside him, not from pain but release. The toy was gone, yet the warmth remained. He fed the flame carefully, whispering, "You did it, Papa. You saved me again." Hours passed, but the storm didn't stop. Snow piled against the door, sealing it shut. The wind howled above, but the cabin stayed standing. The fire held. Zayden and Ash huddled beside it, wrapped in a blanket, sharing body heat. Every few minutes, Zayden would wake and feed the fire another branch, determined not to let it fade. By morning, the blizzard had passed. The world outside was buried, the trees half gone under snow, the stream invisible, the sky a pale gray dome. But inside the cabin, there was light. Zayden pushed open the door. It barely moved, snow blocking the way. He shoved harder until it cracked open just enough for the cold air to rush in. The sunlight hit his face, sharp, clean, almost holy. The valley stretched silent before him, blank and untouched. The storm had erased everything, every track, every sign of struggle. But inside that silence, something stronger had survived. He looked back at the small room. Smoke curled gently from the chimney. The hole in the roof had frozen over, the edges glimmering like glass. The fire glowed steadily. He smiled faintly and whispered, "We made it." Ash stepped beside him, pressing its head against his leg. Zayden ran his fingers through the wolf's thick fur, warm and alive beneath the light. The mountain had taken almost everything from him: warmth, comfort, safety. Yet somehow, in return, it had given him strength. The camera would pull upward again, the cabin half buried in snow, a thin column of smoke rising into the frozen sky. It looked small, fragile, but alive. Inside that glow, a boy and a wolf sat together, guarding the flame that refused to die. And through the crackling of the fire, it almost sounded like the cabin was breathing again. Steam hissed from the iron beast as it climbed through the frozen ridges of Montana. The private train of Alden, the railroad magnate who once bent landscapes to his will, cut across the valley like a silver scar against white. Inside the warm carriage, velvet curtains swayed with the rhythm of steel wheels. Crystal decanters trembled on the table, catching the glow of the lamps. Everything was comfort, everything but the man. Alden sat alone, staring out the window as snow brushed past like ghosts. His hair had grayed early, his posture straight but tired. The newspaper beside him spoke of progress and empire, mines, rails, commerce, yet none of it filled the hollow quiet inside him. Once, he'd built the largest railroad west of the Rockies. Once, he'd had someone to share it with. But that was before the illness took his wife, before the silence in his home grew louder than any train whistle. He loosened his collar and reached for the gold pocket watch she'd given him years ago. Its hands ticked softly, a heartbeat in a world that had forgotten warmth. Outside, the sky darkened, and the conductor entered with hesitation. "Sir," he said, hat in hand, "we'll need to stop. The bridge ahead's been damaged by the thaw." Alden frowned. "How long?" "Until morning, at least. We'll need to inspect it before crossing." The train groaned to a halt. Steam curled upward into the cold evening air. Alden rose, buttoning his coat. "I'll stretch my legs," he muttered. He stepped out into the snow, the wind sharp against his face. The silence hit him first. No city noise, no engines, just the soft hush of the wilderness breathing around him. For the first time in years, he could hear his own heartbeat. He walked past the train tracks, his boots crunching over the frost. The air smelled of pine and iron. Somewhere in the distance, a thin column of smoke drifted upward through the trees. It was faint, barely visible against the white. He paused. "Someone's out there," he asked aloud, though no one answered. His foreman, standing a few yards behind, shook his head. "No one lives up this way, sir. Closest settlement's 50 miles south." But the smoke was real, and Alden's curiosity, the same thing that once built his empire, stirred again. "I'll be back before nightfall," he said. He followed the smoke. The climb was steep, his breath misting in the cold air. He moved past frozen creeks, low-hanging branches, and the whisper of unseen life watching from the woods. The sun dipped lower, casting the forest in gold and shadow. Finally, he reached a clearing. There, standing against the pale horizon, was a cabin, sturdy, clean, alive. Smoke rose steadily from its chimney. The wood looked freshly treated, the door strong, the windows framed with care. A small garden lay beneath the snow, marked by stones in even lines. And outside, a young man was splitting wood. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows, his skin tanned and weathered by sun and work. His movements were calm, deliberate. Beside him stood a large gray wolf, silent but alert, its coat glistening in the dying light. Alden stopped at the edge of the clearing, half in disbelief. "Boy!" he called out. The young man turned. His eyes were steady, unreadable, the color of the mountain sky before rain. "You're not from here," he said simply. Alden stepped closer. "I was passing through. Saw the smoke." He paused, studying him. "You live here alone?" The boy nodded once. "Not alone." His hand brushed the wolf's fur, a gesture of quiet affection. Up close, the place was astonishing, not grand, but whole. A handmade fence ringed the small yard. Herbs hung from a line by the window. The air smelled of pine, wood smoke, and something warm, baked bread, perhaps. Alden hesitated. "May I?" The boy opened the door and stepped aside. Inside, the cabin felt nothing like the ruin Alden had expected. The floor was swept clean, the fire steady, its light filling the space with gold. Shelves lined the walls, holding jars of dried herbs, bundles of roots, and a few books whose spines were worn thin. And on the table, among neatly folded cloths and a few hand-carved tools, sat a small wooden carving, the head of a horse. It was rough but carefully shaped, its edges smoothed by time. Alden stared at it. "You built all this?" he asked. The young man's gaze softened. "The mountain gave what it could. I gave the rest." The answer struck him like a blow. Simple, honest, complete. Alden looked around the room again. The fire, the wolf resting by the hearth, the smell of life in a place that should have been desolate. There was warmth here, but not the kind money could buy. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. "Zayden." Alden nodded slowly. "And how long have you lived here, Zayden?" Zayden looked toward the window, where snow still fell in quiet sheets. "Since I stopped waiting to be saved." The older man said nothing. For the first time in years, he didn't have words ready. No command, no explanation, no business tone to hide behind. He just stood there, watching a boy who had turned loneliness into something beautiful. He wanted to ask how it happened, how a child could survive here, how he learned, how he endured, but the questions caught in his throat. Some truths didn't need to be spoken to be understood. Zayden offered him a seat near the fire. Alden sat, his hands open on his knees, feeling the warmth seep through his gloves. The wolf lay watching him, calm but alert. They spoke little. Silence carried its own kind of conversation. The crack of the fire, the pop of sap in the wood, the soft sound of snow against the roof. Alden looked at the boy again and thought of his younger self. Ambitious, proud, blind to what mattered. When he finally rose to leave, the boy walked him to the door. The sky outside was fading to blue, and the forest had turned to shadow. "Thank you," Alden said, "for the fire." Zayden smiled faintly. "It was already here. You just needed to feel it again." Alden hesitated, unsure what to say. He stepped out into the cold, turning back only once. Through the window, he could see the glow of the fire, the movement of the wolf, and the quiet figure tending the hearth. As he made his way back toward the tracks, snow crunching beneath his boots, one thought followed him, a voice that wasn't quite his own, "Since I stopped waiting to be saved." For the rest of the night, that line echoed in him, louder than the whistle of the train, louder than the years of silence he'd carried. In the middle of the wilderness, he had met a boy who had nothing, and yet somehow had everything Alden had lost. The next morning, frost still clung to the trees when Alden returned to the valley. His coat was dusted with snow, his gloves stiff from cold, yet his steps carried a kind of restless purpose. He hadn't slept. The boy's voice, "Since I stopped waiting to be saved," kept echoing in his mind through the long hours of the night. He brought food this time, a basket of bread, dried fruit, a flask of coffee, things that suddenly felt too small a gesture for the debt he couldn't name. When he reached the cabin, smoke was already curling from the chimney. Zayden was outside, stacking wood. The wolf, Ash, lifted its head but didn't growl. "You came back," Zayden said, not surprised. "I wasn't sure you'd welcome me." Zayden shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "The fire welcomes everyone who brings warmth." They spent that morning fixing part of the roof that had given way to the thaw. Alden, unused to such work, fumbled with the tools. His hands, soft from years of comfort, grew blistered and raw. Zayden worked beside him in quiet rhythm, his movements sure and steady. He didn't mock the older man, didn't even instruct. He simply led by doing. By afternoon, the roof no longer leaked. Alden looked at the repaired boards, breathing hard. "You make it look easy," he said. "It isn't," Zayden replied, tying off the last rope. "But things worth keeping never are." The words lingered longer than the hammer's echo. He came again the next week, this time with books, volumes on mechanics, maps, and a collection of poetry that had belonged to his late wife. "They're yours," he said, handing them over awkwardly. "I thought you might want to read." Zayden flipped through one, smiling softly at the fading ink. "Words can live a long time," he said, "even when people don't." They began trading lessons, knowledge for survival. Zayden taught him how to read the tracks in the snow, how to tell a storm by the way the wind shifted, how to start a fire using bark and steel. In return, Alden showed him how to repair tools, measure land, and build sturdy foundations. The days passed like this, each visit less about curiosity and more about quiet need. The boy was teaching him something beyond skill, something he had forgotten long before money replaced meaning. One night, they sat by the fire, the wolf dozing nearby. Snow drifted gently outside. Alden stared into the flames and spoke without looking at Zayden. "I spent years thinking wealth meant freedom," he said softly. "I built railroads, cities, everything a man could want. But when my wife died, I realized something." Zayden waited. "I thought being rich meant never needing anyone. But maybe it just made me forget how to care." The boy looked at him quietly for a long time before saying, "Things only live if someone cares." Alden turned toward him, and for the first time in many years, a small, honest smile broke through the lines of grief on his face. It wasn't joy exactly, more like a thaw, slow and uncertain, but real. "Maybe that's what I've been missing," he murmured. Over the next weeks, their bond deepened. Alden brought supplies, not as gifts but as tools for rebuilding: nails, timber, rope, even seeds for spring planting. They repaired the old barn beside the cabin, turning it into a small shelter for travelers. At night, Alden found himself speaking freely, something he hadn't done in years. He told stories about his wife, about the first rail line he built through the Rockies, about the child they never had. Xaden listened without pity, his eyes calm and clear, like someone who understood pain but had long made peace with it. "You remind me of something," Alden said one evening, watching the boy feed the fire. "A world that used to make sense." Xaden glanced at him. "Maybe it still can." The cabin glowed behind them, warm against the dark. The sound of the wolf's breathing, the hiss of wood, the hush of snow, everything felt steady, like life had quietly returned to its proper rhythm. By early spring, Alden had stopped referring to his visits as passing through. He stayed longer each time, sometimes days. He helped mend fences, plant herbs, and even fish in the frozen creek. He laughed once, truly laughed, when Ash snatched his glove and ran off with it into the trees. Xaden looked up from his work, smiling faintly. "You sound alive again." Alden's laughter softened into silence. "Maybe I am." When he returned to his train weeks later, the carriages felt emptier than before. The polished wood, the silk curtains, the golden fixtures, all of it gleamed coldly back at him. The warmth he'd felt in that cabin made the rest of his world look hollow. He stared out the window as the landscape blurred past, snow giving way to thawing fields, and whispered, "Things only live if someone cares." The next day, he ordered the train back toward the mountains. He didn't know why exactly. Maybe to bring more tools. Maybe to repair another fence. Or maybe because for the first time in years, he had somewhere, and someone to return to. When he arrived, Xaden was repairing a trap near the stream. The wolf barked once in greeting. Alden smiled, setting down a new bag of seeds. "This place could grow something beautiful," he said. Xaden nodded, brushing mud from his hands. "It already has." They stood together in silence for a long while, two men from different worlds, bound by the same quiet need to rebuild what life had once taken. As the sun set over the valley, the boy and the man watched the light touch the snow, turning it gold. For Alden, it felt like watching the end of winter, not just in the mountains, but inside himself. Spring came slowly that year, the kind that carried both warmth and sorrow. The snow melted from the valley in quiet streams, revealing green beneath the white. Buds formed on the birches, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine sap. Xaden stood by the garden he and Alden had built, pressing seeds into the soft soil. Ash lay stretched in the sunlight, head resting on his paws, while Alden repaired a wooden fence nearby. It was peace, the kind that feels earned. The boy who once shivered in the dark now whistled softly as he worked, and the man who once hid from the world had begun to smile without needing to remember how. But peace has its shadows. And sometimes, even in rebirth, the past finds its way back. Far below, along the narrow road winding through the foothills, a lone figure struggled against the incline. Her clothes were torn, her hair streaked with gray. Her face, once proud, was marked by years of regret. Vanessa had been walking for 2 days without rest, her feet blistered, her heart heavier with every step. She had heard rumors in the nearby town of a young man who lived deep in the mountains, alone but alive, building something extraordinary from nothing. A boy who spoke to the land and made it listen. At first, she thought it couldn't be him. The guilt had long convinced her he'd perished in those early winters. But when she saw a carving sold by a traveling merchant, a small wooden horse, rough but familiar, she knew. Her hands shook as she held it, whispering his name like a prayer, Xaden. Now, as she climbed higher, her breath came in shallow gasps. Every step cut through her strength like pennants carved into flesh. She stumbled once, catching herself on a rock, and murmured, "Just a little further." By the time she reached the ridge, her legs trembled beneath her. The sound of running water met her ears, the creek she had once crossed years ago. Beyond it, smoke rose from a cabin chimney, steady and strong. The sight stole the air from her chest. She moved closer, half crawling the last few yards until the clearing opened before her eyes. The garden, the wolf, the boy, no, the man, standing in sunlight. Xaden. Her body gave out. She fell to her knees, sobbing into her hands. The sound broke the quiet air. Xaden looked up from his work, startled. Alden straightened near the fence, his eyes narrowing as he saw the stranger collapse. Xaden hesitated only a moment before walking toward her. His steps were cautious but unafraid. Ash followed close behind, his low growl fading as the woman's crying deepened. When Xaden stopped in front of her, she raised her head. Her face was streaked with tears, her lips trembling as she whispered, "I came to beg forgiveness." He stared at her for a long moment, unblinking. The years fell away in silence. The sound of that night, the count to 10, the echo of carriage wheels vanishing into snow. She clasped her hands together, desperate, her voice breaking. "I left you to die. I don't deserve to see you. I just needed to know you lived." Xaden's jaw tensed. For a long while, he said nothing. Then, without a word, he turned and walked to the creek. He knelt, dipped a tin cup into the cold water, and carried it back to her. "Drink," he said softly. "The mountain doesn't ask who deserves its water." Vanessa took the cup with shaking hands. She stared at it as if it were something holy, then drank, the cold cutting through her throat, shocking her heart back to life. When she lowered the cup, her tears came harder, unstoppable. "You should hate me," she whispered. Xaden looked down at her, the woman who had once promised to return. His eyes held no anger now, only quiet understanding. "Hate would have kept me frozen," he said. "I had to let it go to stay alive." Behind them, Alden stood silently, the hammer slipping from his grasp. The sight struck something deep in him, a truth too heavy for words. He turned away, walking a few steps toward the trees, pretending to check the fence line. But his hands trembled. Vanessa pressed her palms to her face, sobbing again. "I don't know how to live with what I did." Xaden crouched beside her, resting a hand lightly on her shoulder. "Then start by helping what still can live." She looked up at him, eyes red and raw. "You'd let me stay?" "If the mountain forgave you," he said simply, "who am I not to?" For a long moment, she could only stare at him. The boy she left had become something larger than she could understand, not hardened by pain, but transformed by it. She bowed her head. "I don't deserve your kindness." Xaden stood, looking toward the sun climbing higher through the clouds. "Kindness isn't earned," he said quietly. "It's remembered." Alden finally turned back. His eyes met Xaden's, then Vanessa's. He didn't speak. There was nothing to add. But in that silent exchange, something inside him shifted, a reminder that forgiveness was not weakness, but strength. Xaden helped Vanessa to her feet. Her hands were cold, her knees weak, but she stood. The wolf sniffed at her cautiously before returning to the shade. Alden stepped forward then, offering his arm for balance. "There's food inside," he said. "You can rest." She nodded, still unable to meet his gaze. Together, they led her into the cabin. Later that evening, as the sun fell behind the mountains, The three of them sat in silence by the fire. The flames flickered softly across their faces. The boy who survived, the man who rediscovered his heart, and the woman who had come seeking forgiveness she thought impossible. Vanessa spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought the world had forgotten him. I thought God had too." Alden looked at Xaden, then back to her. "The world forgets. But some hearts don't." The wolf stirred by the door, curling tighter against the warmth. Outside, the night wind swept through the valley, carrying the scent of pine and rain. For the first time in years, Vanessa slept without dreams of snow. And for the first time in his life, Xaden looked at the fire and saw not a reminder of survival, but of peace. The first true summer in the valley arrived like a slow awakening. The mountains, once harsh and cold, now glowed green with life. Wildflowers stretched toward the sun, and the river sang louder as the ice melted from its veins. For the first time since he was a boy, Xaden didn't see the cabin as a shelter from the world, but as the beginning of one. He and Alden worked side by side through those long days. They built with their hands, with sweat, and with quiet hope. The old cabin stood firm, its wood scarred but strong, a reminder of where everything began. Beside it, new walls rose, shaped by steady hammers and laughter that carried across the open air. Vanessa, though still frail, helped where she could, gathering herbs, mending clothes, or tending the small garden by the creek. Ash, the wolf who had once howled to the lonely stars, now circled the edge of the valley, his presence both warning and welcome. Travelers began to arrive one by one, drifters, widows, and children who had nowhere else to go. Alden would meet them at the foot of the path, offering food and rest. Xaden would greet them with open hands and no questions asked. They called the place the Haven. It began small, a few beds, a kitchen, a roof that didn't leak. But soon, laughter filled the air again. Children ran through the meadows chasing butterflies, their shouts echoing where once there had been only silence. Women sang as they cooked, their voices weaving through the sound of rushing water. Even the wind seemed softer here, carrying not sorrow but the hum of renewal. Xaden moved among them quietly, teaching as he went. He showed the children how to plant seeds and read the forest signs, how to care for what sustains them. He repaired shoes, carved toys, and listened to the stories of those who arrived with nothing but pain. When they asked how he learned to survive alone, he would smile and say, "The mountain taught me. I just learned to listen." Alden, who had once measured his worth by the miles of rail he owned, began to measure it instead by the number of lives warmed by this valley. He provided supplies, tools, and funds for expansion, but always let Xaden lead. "You understand hearts better than I ever could," he would say. "I just know how to build walls." To which Xaden replied, "Then build them strong enough to keep the wind out, but never the people." The two worked as equals, bonded not by obligation but by choice. Alden often watched Xaden with a quiet pride, a boy who had risen from abandonment to become a pillar of compassion. In Xaden's calm strength, Alden saw what he'd been searching for all his life. A reason beyond survival, beyond profit, beyond himself. One evening, as twilight deepened over the mountains, they sat together on the porch of the new house. The sound of children laughing drifted from the nearby fields. Vanessa hummed softly by the fire, darning a torn blanket. The wolf lay near her feet, his eyes half closed, content. Alden stared at the horizon, where the last light of day bled into the clouds. "I used to think the only bridges worth building were made of iron," he said after a long silence. "I spent half my life building them for trains. You helped me build one back to my heart." Xaden smiled faintly. "It's a good bridge," he said. strong enough to last. They sat in silence for a while longer, the kind that felt complete, the kind that spoke without words. The wind rustled through the valley, carrying the scent of pine, soil, and life renewed. In the weeks that followed, the haven continued to grow. Alden used his connections to bring supplies and craftsmen. Old railway workers, veterans, and widows arrived to lend their strength. A carpenter came from the nearby town and stayed. A teacher followed, offering to teach the children letters and numbers. Zayden built a small schoolhouse beside the creek, where laughter could mix with the splash of water. Every night, the valley glowed with fires and lamplight, tiny constellations scattered across the earth. People would gather around the central fire, sharing stories, songs, and the simple joy of being seen. Zayden always listened more than he spoke. Alden, sitting beside him, would sometimes catch himself smiling for no reason other than peace. Vanessa, humbled by the grace she'd been given, found her own way to belong. She became a caretaker for the children who had lost their parents, tucking them into bed, telling them stories from a time long gone. She never once asked for forgiveness again. She didn't have to. It was already living in the laughter that surrounded her. One night, as rain began to fall softly over the valley, Alden walked out to the old cabin. He ran a hand over the rough wood, tracing the scars in the grain. The fire inside still burned, smaller now, but steady. He turned to Zayden, who stood in the doorway. "You never tore it down," Alden said quietly. Zayden shook his head. "It's part of me. You don't bury the roots of what taught you to grow." They stood together in the soft rain, listening to the roof drip. Alden felt something tighten in his chest, not pain, but gratitude. "You know," he said softly, "this place, it's more than a refuge. It's proof." "Of what?" Zayden asked. "That broken things can still make something whole." The boy nodded, his face calm in the firelight. "Only if someone believes they can." The rain eased, leaving the valley shining under the moonlight. The wolf howled once, not a cry of sorrow, but a song of belonging. In that sound, Alden felt every bridge he had ever built fade to the background. This valley, this peace, was the one worth crossing. By the time dawn rose, the land glistened with new life. Smoke curled from chimneys, roosters crowed, and the sound of children waking filled the air. The haven had become what its name promised, a home for those who had none. For Zayden, it was the life his father's toy horse had dreamed of, a light kept alive until it found its purpose. For Alden, it was the end of loneliness. For Vanessa, it was redemption that didn't need words. And for the mountain, it was the proof that kindness, once planted, could grow even from frozen ground. Morning came gently over the valley. Mist rose from the creek, catching the sunlight like silver threads as children's laughter echoed across the water. A group of them, barefoot, joyful, free, splashed in the shallows, chasing minnows with tin cups and shouting each other's names. Their laughter carried far, up to the cabins and across the green slopes where the first wildflowers had bloomed. The old cabin still stood, its wood darkened with time but glowing softly from within. The fire inside never truly went out anymore. Someone was always there to keep it alive. Smoke curled from the chimney, weaving into the blue morning air like a memory that refused to fade. Near the garden, Vanessa knelt among rows of herbs and young vegetables. Her hands, once jeweled and delicate, were now lined and steady. She wore a simple shawl, her hair tied back. Each motion was careful, humble, a kind of prayer done through work. She paused to watch two children tugging weeds beside her and smiled faintly when one of them handed her a small purple flower. "Keep it," she said softly. It belongs to you now. Further up the hill, Alden sat near the fire pit outside the larger house, a book open on his knee. His hair was fully gray now, but his eyes carried warmth that hadn't been there when he first arrived years before. Occasionally, he'd look up from the page to watch Zayden nearby, surrounded by a small circle of children. Zayden held a wooden plank steady while one of the boys hammered a nail through it. Easy, he said, steadying the child's hand. Let the wood guide you, don't fight it. The boy nodded, focused. The others gathered around, fascinated, watching the birdhouse take shape piece by piece. When the final nail was set, Zayden lifted the little house and smiled. There, he said, showing it to them. A place for something small to belong. One of the younger girls tugged on his sleeve. Do you think the birds will really come? They will, he said, as long as someone keeps it safe. The children smiled, proud of what they'd made. Ash, now older but still strong, wandered closer and lay at their feet, his tail brushing through the grass. Alden closed his book, setting it aside. He watched the boy he'd once found in the snow, no longer a boy at all, but a leader, a teacher, a man who had turned survival into purpose. For Alden, it was like seeing hope made flesh. He stood, walking toward them. You've built more than homes here, he said quietly. You've built hearts. Zayden glanced at him, the same calm smile in his eyes. That's what homes are for. As the afternoon deepened, the valley moved like a living thing, full of motion, light, and gentle sound. Children fetched water from the creek. Women baked bread in outdoor ovens. A group of men repaired the roof of one of the guest cabins. Everything worked in quiet harmony, as if the mountain itself approved. By evening, when the sun melted into gold and pink across the peaks, a soft stillness fell. The people of the haven gathered around the main fire. Music rose, a fiddle someone had brought years ago, the sound rough but sweet. Laughter mixed with stories. Alden sat among them, smiling as he passed bread to a small girl. Vanessa sat nearby, sewing by the firelight, her head bowed in contentment. Zayden stood at the edge of the gathering, watching. His eyes roamed over what had become of the life he'd once feared would end in loneliness. The old cabin stood behind him, light glowing through its windows. For a moment, he thought he saw a flicker, the memory of a boy curled beside a dying fire, whispering, "Don't worry, house. I'll take care of you." He smiled faintly. He had kept that promise. The wind shifted through the valley, carrying with it the sound of running water and laughter. Overhead, stars began to appear one by one. In that quiet, a voice, steady, gentle, and full of memory, seemed to speak as if carried by the mountain itself. Years later, travelers told stories about the boy who turned a ruin into a refuge, and the man who found his soul there. The scene softened, the fire's glow spreading across faces, laughter rising into the night. They said the cabin never went dark again, that its light reached the road below, guiding strangers who had lost their way. Some came hungry, some came broken, but all left changed. The camera drifts across the valley, over the old cabin, still standing like a guardian of the past, over Vanessa's garden, rich with color, over Alden's hands turning a page, over Zayden and the children releasing the finished birdhouse into the tree. And when the wind moved through the valley at dusk, people swore they could still hear his words. A whisper follows, faint and warm, Zayden's voice, now a memory echoing through time. If you keep the light alive, even broken things can learn to breathe again. The sound fades into the night air. The fire crackles. The stars glow brighter. The camera pulls back slowly, revealing the haven nestled between the mountains, a glow of light and life surrounded by the endless wild. Smoke from the chimneys drifts upward, blending into the stars like threads of hope. If this story touched your heart, tell us where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support keeps stories like this alive. And remember, sometimes the smallest light can change the darkest night.